This is video number 2 for BTEC Nationals IT, Unit 6, and we're going to look at programming paradigms. Now, every bit of software that we use, whether it be Microsoft Word, or a database such as Microsoft Access, a web browser such as Microsoft Internet Explorer, or any web page within the web browser such as Google, or Facebook, or eBay, or a specialist bit of software such as Google Earth. Any of these have to be created with something called programming languages. And there's an example of some programming code from a programming language just there. At this point, it's worth mentioning that the human brain is much more cleverer and much more complicated than the poor old computer. Our human brain is a very complex thing. Plus, we have something called common sense, which a computer doesn't have. A computer can process and work out lots of precise instructions and do it very quickly. But all it can understand really are ones and zeros, or to give it its correct term, binary. It can only understand 1 or 0. It can understand lots of ones and zeros. In fact, a series of ones and zeros in a particular order will make the computer do something very precise. But for a human to be able to program in just ones and zeros would be very difficult, because we'd have to know long combinations of ones and zeros. So we translate it into something called symbolic languages, which are closer to English. So a command like new J button will be a long list of ones and zeros in a particular combination. So symbolic languages are more like English. To be able to understand the different ways that we can program computers, we need to understand something called programming paradigms. Now, programming paradigms are the style of programming language we're going to use. We might term them as being a dimension of programming. Programming paradigms are suited to the nature of a problem to be solved. So I like to term a programming paradigm as being the nature of a programming language. What is it naturally good at? Varying sources will tell you there are some paradigms, other sources will tell you there are more. So there's no precise or definitive list of programming paradigms. Some people say some things are programming paradigms, and other people say that others are. The BTEC Nationals course says there are 3 main types: procedural programming languages, object-oriented programming, or OOP, and in the BTEC guidance it might be known as object-orientated programming, just slightly different from object-oriented. And there's event-driven programming. So we'll look at these 3 in a little more detail now. Procedural programming languages have been around since the 1950s. Examples are BASIC, which is the very first version of what has turned into Visual Basic and VisualBasic.net. There's COBOL, which might look a bit like that, Fortran, Pascal. Procedural programming languages consist of procedures, such as subroutines and functions. What this means is you'll have blocks of code that will do certain jobs, and these blocks of code are called from a main procedure. So the top one on the right here could be a function, it could be a subroutine, this one could be a function, and these are called from a main procedure. Object-oriented programming has been around since the 1970s. It's suited to very complex solutions. It was developed because procedural programming was not sophisticated enough to solve very complex problems. Programs are divided up into objects, which will swap data and can do useful things using something called methods. It can be very difficult for beginners to learn OOP. Examples of OOP languages might be Java, that might look a bit like that, C++, Smalltalk. Finally, event-driven programming. This only really came about with the introduction of graphical user interfaces such as Windows, where we're able to click and point and drag. First version of Windows came about in 1985, that should say. I'm going to change that now. Not 95. Thanks for waiting there. Code is determined by user actions, such as clicking on a button, dragging an icon, or selecting a choice from a menu. Events can trigger procedural code or OOP code. So event-driven programming allows for the use of the other two paradigms we've looked at within there. So event-driven programming can be written in most languages as long as the event-driven environment exists. So within an integrated development environment, like an IDE, like we saw with VB.NET, you'll be able to click on a button and fire some code. That's an example of event-driven programming. Bye for now.